Okay, hi, welcome to part two of this 4.3 lesson. We're going to start with cycling or recycling of matter or recycling in nature, how that works. So if you're following along with your slides, we're on slide number 6. Okay, so first and foremost, I want to go over this analogy right here. So the analogy right here is telling us that nutrients are recycled through a biogeochemical cycle. The cycles are powered by that one-way flow of energy through the biosphere, and it's similar to water powering a mill's water wheel. So we're looking at the cycle of matter, and the cycle of matter continues to cycle in a circular formation, but the energy flows. It does not cycle. It flows through the ecosystem or the biosphere. So this is what we should be thinking about when we think about what the difference is between the energy or the cycles of energy and the cycles of matter, or energy flow versus cycles of matter. So there are things that power the cycle of matter, and energy is used to power the cycle of matter. All right, so number one thing to remember always is that matter and energy can never be created nor destroyed. So the amount of energy in anywhere is not created nor destroyed. It will be transferred from one thing to the other. Same with matter. So matter is going to break bonds and bring bonds together to create new matter, or not really to create, but to, I can't say create because it cannot be created nor destroyed, but it will come together and appear to be different. So CO2 is carbon and oxygen. Those two will come together to create carbon dioxide, which is a different compound, and a different thing altogether. But the rearranging of those atoms is what's causing certain things to let go of energy, or absorb energy. All right, so compounds need to rearrange, and energy must flow from one to another. Again, remember, energy flows in one direction only. It cannot go backwards. So matter flows from one trophic level to another, and elements are recycled within and among the ecosystems. So matter, again, is like that wheel. It's recycling over and over again, where energy is just flowing through the trophic levels. When matter flows, it's called a biogeochemical cycle, and those are powered by the flow of energy. All right, so processes that drive these cycles. So on this side, you see a wheel, and that causes global change. So these are the things that are going to cause global change. So biological processes, geological processes, human activity, physical and chemical processes. Now you see that if you look at it real tiny, it has an atmosphere, has a hydrosphere, a geosphere, and a biosphere. And that's what we're going to be talking about, and where it cycles. So the water cycle is going to cycle within the hydrosphere, I'm sorry, and the atmosphere. And it's also going to cycle through the geosphere. So it's going to cycle through every single one of these, but there are certain cycles that do not um, flow through each other or cycle through each other. So biological processes, activities performed by living organisms, so photosynthesis, eating, burning, eliminating waste, those are examples of biological processes. All these biological processes um, have to be broken down. That matter needs to be broken down and then recycled into something else. So elimination, waste elimination, it's going to be broken down and denitrificated and going to flow back into that ecosystem. So mainly occur in the biosphere, but it does affect all three other spheres. So it happens in biosphere, but it affects the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, and the geosphere. Geological processes are volcanic eruptions, formations, and breaking down of rock, major movements of matter within and below the surface of the earth. So volcanic eruptions is a big one. It's going to spew out lots and lots of carbon. Now that is going to occur in the geosphere, but it affects all of the others. So an eruption can cause acid rain, and that's going to affect the hydrosphere, and so on and so forth. It could affect all of the other spheres, but it happens in the geosphere. Physical and chemical processes. So cloud formation, um, precipitation, flow of running water, the action of lightning. So these will occur in either the hydrosphere, the geosphere, and then affect all of the other. Okay, so human activities, we have mining, burning fuel, burning fossil fuels, clearing land, cutting or burning and replanting of forests, manufacture and the use of fertilizers. These changes represent our outer ring in this picture over here. And that's where it causes these global changes in the orange area. All right, so the water cycle. I don't know where to put myself. All right, the water cycle among the hydrosphere, the atmosphere, and the geosphere, sometimes outside the biosphere and sometimes within it. So it does happen in the hydrosphere, atmosphere, and geosphere, and sometimes within the biosphere. Water enters the atmosphere through water vapor, then the ocean and other parts of the hydrosphere. Water can also enter by evaporating leaves. So these are the two ways that it's going to enter the atmosphere. This is one of your questions. It's going to ask you at the end of your this presentation. So water vapor can be transported through the atmosphere. If the water vapor cools, the clouds are formed. If the clouds become heavy, it will rain, snow, sleet, or hail. Precipitation flows into the river or stream as runoff. The water is absorbed into the soil. Some of it becomes groundwater, and some of it becomes water that goes very deep into the geosphere, and it's going to go into these reservoirs. Water then re-enters the atmosphere and starts a cycle all over again. So this is a highlighted slide because you're going to use this at the end. All right, nutrient cycles. So every organism needs nutrients to build tissue and carry out life. So keep in mind, carbohydrates are made of carbon. So every single organism, living organism, is going to need carbon. It's going to need oxygen. It's going to need nitrogen, phosphorus. Nitrogen and phosphorus are important for nucleic acids and DNA. So all of these cycles are very important to living things, organisms that are living. So like water, nutrients pass through the organisms in the environment through a biogeochemical cycle. Cycles that carry carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus through the biosphere are especially vital for life. Oxygen participates in the cycles by combining with the elements and cycling through with them. So oxygen allows this cycle to happen because it is able to combine with them. So three nutrient cycles are called carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. All right, our carbon cycle. Carbon cycle is so important because anything that is living will need carbon. So we learned that in our chemistry of life chapter, where carbon is the most important. All things, all living things are made of carbon, and they need that carbon. So biological process of carbon is that plants and algae remove the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by photosynthesis and return some of it by respiration. So primary producers make carbohydrates from the CO2. So they're going to process the majority of the carbon in the atmosphere, create carbohydrates for us and for other animals, for heterotrophs, and they will then use those carbohydrates to build protein, lipids, and nucleic acids. Animals die, the decomposers usually break down their bodies, releasing the carbon. Sometimes primary producers are buried before they decompose, which also stores the carbon under buried sediment. So they transform, once they're buried, this is what they call fossil fuels. So once they're buried, they transform into coal deposits, and then marine algae transform into oil and natural gas, and those are called fossil fuels. So once they're fossilized, this organic carbon can then become a fossil fuel. Now, the problem is that once we use this fossilized carbon, we use it very quickly and we return all of that carbon back to the atmosphere way quicker than new deposits can be formed. And so the problem is that once we return it, the cycle is not as quick as what we are putting out there. So during northern temperate zone summer, the plants are actively removing the carbon by photosynthesis, but in the winter months, it slows down, but decomposition and respiration continue. So the measurements taken in Hawaii during research shows an increase in carbon. So we can measure carbon, we can measure how much carbon there are in the atmosphere. And so in Hawaii, they do this study yearly where they look at how much carbon there is in a particular area in the northern temperate zone. And in the summer, the plants are very active. They are actively removing that CO2 from the atmosphere. And so the carbon is a lot lower. But during the winter months, it slows down quite a bit. But decomposition and respiration continues. And so respiration is when we are returning some of that carbon into the atmosphere. We're using the oxygen the plants are giving us. We're returning some of that carbon in the atmosphere. So respiration and decomposition still happen. And so it's causing because the plants are more dormant, it's causing a higher reading in the carbon. All right, so carbon cycles continued. So geological processes. So carbon in the ocean combines with calcium and magnesium to form carbonates. These carbonates will combine with skeleton and harden into sedimentary rock to form limestone and dolomite. So limestone is made from carbonates, also fossils and skeletons. A lot of fossils and skeletons have this carbonate as well. And so then that's where we form limestone. Limestone is very, very common here in Florida and in other parts of the world that are coastal marine areas. So in some places, these rocks get pushed down so far that the carbon is released in gas, and then volcanoes release it as they erupt. So again, the carbon cycle, we can see it in the geological process of the formation and the breaking down of rocks themselves. So when those rocks get pushed down through the rock cycle, don't know if you remember learning this or not, in 7th grade or in 6th grade, I think is earth science. So the rocks get pushed down. As they push down, they melt, that gas is released, but then it goes into the volcano, and then the volcano erupts and it shoots out all of this carbon into the atmosphere. So chemical and physical processes. So carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can also dissolve in rainwater, then forming a weak acid. This is where the terminology of acid rain comes in. It is that carbon that is now mixing with the rainwater and forming that acid. Human activity. So we extract and burn the fossil fuels of the coal, and we return a lot of that CO2 back into the atmosphere. We release carbon faster than the cycle actually occurs. We talked about this already. So our addition of CO2 to the atmosphere is significantly adding to the greenhouse effect, raising the average global temperature, and driving that climate change that we talk about all the time. All right, nitrogen cycles. So nitrogen cycles, here, we're gonna go over it. So all animals need nitrogen to make amino acids. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. All animals need protein in order to survive. And so in order to make those amino acids, we need that nitrogen. So the nitrogen cycle is very important for our well-being. So biggest reservoir of nitrogen is in the atmosphere. So A lot of you may know or may not know or may think that all of the oxygen or all of the atmosphere is made of oxygen. That's not true. So 78% of the air that we actually breathe in is nitrogen, and we will release that again as nitrogen. However, only that extra percentage is oxygen, the rest is nitrogen. So 78% is nitrogen. In the biosphere, we have ammonia, nitrates, and nitrites, and that's found in the soil, waste produced, dead and decaying matter. So natural processes. So nitrogen gas is abundant, but most organisms cannot use it the way that it is. So we need certain bacteria in order to convert that nitrogen into something that we can use. So the bacteria will convert nitrogen into ammonia. And then that is the process, or that process is called nitrogen fixation. So a lot of the time when we are building up a tank, like a fish tank, let's say, and this is, I'm only using fish tank because that's what I know, that's what I've done before. So when we set up our fish tank, we set up our saltwater fish tank or freshwater fish tank, either way, we need that bacteria to build up. We put certain things in that fish tank in order to replicate, to cause this bacteria to duplicate itself. And it's important because the bacteria is what's going to allow the fish not to die. The fish cannot live with ammonia. And so we need the bacteria to turn that nitrogen, use that nitrogen, turn that ammonia into something useful or less harmful for the fish and maybe useful for other things in order for those fish to be able to survive. So nitrogen fixation is very, very important in aquatic ecosystems. So some bacteria live in the soil and in roots of plants like peanuts and peas. Lightning can fix small amounts of nitrogen. So lightning also has a purpose. So when lightning happens in the soil, it'll fix a certain amount of nitrogen into something that other organisms can use. So other bacteria convert ammonia into nitrites and then nitrate. So nitrite is a little harmful towards animals like starfish and crabs and um, snails, invertebrates, and things like that. So a nitrite is not good either. So we need another bacteria to then use the nitrite to change it into a nitrate. And nitrate is not great, but it doesn't kill any of your aquatic system. So one of the reasons why we use this whole bacteria, they even sell like little bottles of bacteria, is because it's important to fix that nitrogen in the tank and before adding livestock in the tank. So decomposers will release nitrogen from animal waste and dead organisms that produce and take and then producers will take that up again. Some bacteria obtain energy by converting nitrates into nitrogen gas and then released into the atmosphere by denitrification. So a lot of bacteria is helping us here in this cycle. Bacteria, it seems to be one of the lead players in this particular cycle. So human activities. So when two German scientists developed a way to remove nitrogen from the air and create a fertilizer, this allowed humans to fix more nitrogen than all natural processes combined. And so there was a scientist who was able to remove nitrogen from the gas and use that nitrogen as a fertilizer for plants. So yes, helped a lot of the crops and a lot of being able to grow crops faster for feeding purposes to feed people of that country, but then caused more nitrogen to be released into the air, into the atmosphere, and then causing more problems because that was more than what the actual cycle can handle. So human activity, although we come up with something all the time that's to better our lives, can tend to hurt our ecosystem. And so we have to think of all the different ways and what the pros and cons are for every single idea that we come up with. All right, the phosphorus cycle. So the phosphorus cycle, phosphorus is essential to life. And I don't know if you remember, but nucleic acid needs phosphorus, right? It's the cho-cho-chomp of the equation. So chomp is carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and phosphorus, and nitrogen and phosphorus. So phosphorus is essential for DNA and RNA. So anything that's living has DNA and RNA, which means that they need phosphorus. So phosphorus does not cycle through the atmosphere. It's one of those that does not occur in the atmosphere. It's a reservoir. So there is one reservoir of inorganic phosphorus found in the geosphere in the form of phosphate rock and soil minerals. So it's in our geosphere. Another reservoir is located in the hydrosphere in the form of dissolved phosphate and phosphate sediments in the freshwater and marine environments. So those are the two locations where you can find phosphorus, and that's how it would cycle. So in this particular, I want to briefly talk about phosphorus a little bit more because it's one of your discussion questions. So in this particular picture up here, we have phosphorus that is mined and turned into fertilizer and applied to crops. Excess may wash into rivers, streams, and oceans as runoff. So when this happens and we have a lot of excess going into these rivers and streams, what do you think these fertilizers are then doing to our ecosystems in the water, right? So we're going to get a lot more than we can cycle in these areas. And that's going to cause a problem. And I want you to maybe just look it up and look to see what that causes. And there is a show, I think on Netflix, called Rotten, that they talk about the sugar canes in Florida. And there was a recent issue with algae growing out of control and a lot of marine ecosystems being hurt and the fishes dying and whatnot. And it had to do a lot with the sugarcane and the fertilizers that were being used on these sugar farms, and how that runoff then caused that whole algae buildup and the dying of that of particular species in that ecosystem. So look that up. It's really interesting. It's a really good show to watch. All right, so this is our last slide before we get to our questions. So nutrient limitation. So in soil, we have plant growth can be limited. So nutrient limitation is a particular nutrient that is limited and is going to cause an issue if it is limited or if we have too much of it, if an excess. So in soil, plant growth can be limited if there is a short supply of nutrient in the soil. Farmers use fertilizers that contain nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Micronutrients also include calcium, magnesium, sulfur, iron, and manganese. Carbon is not included because plants absorb it from the atmosphere. So applying too much fertilizer to soil near streams and rivers can then disrupt natural nutrient cycles with serious consequences. So if we have fertilizers in areas where we have a lot of runoff water, then that fertilizer is going to be carried through that ecosystem and cause an issue in that ecosystem. So we have to be careful with those type of nutrients where they should be limited. They are not being limited. And there is actual, there's a lot of places here in Florida that you can go and do these drive-by nature drives. And then it'll explain to you the process by which you can see the differences or whatnot, what they're doing with the ecosystem to help it because of fertilizer, because of other things that they've put into our Everglades and causing an issue within that Everglades. So I will look some up and put them up on discussion so you guys could see them. I've been to a couple and we've done the entire little drive-by thing and I've learned so much from it, and it was actually a lot of fun. So something that you could even do now in quarantine with your parents if they want to drive through and do that with you guys. So in aquatic ecosystems, in the ocean, nitrogen is often the limiting nutrient. So in streams, lake, and fresh water, phosphorus is the limiting nutrient. So sometimes runoff will deliver large amounts of limiting nutrients into the aquatic systems. And this stimulates the primary producer, such as algae, to bloom. What happens when algae blooms out of control? Well, if algae is covering the top layer of the water, then the bottom plants cannot survive. And then that is the food for the fish, crawfish, reproductive areas for these fish to lay their eggs and things like that. So now we are damaging whatever is under the water. So that thick algae that grows on top is going to absorb all of the sunlight, use it for them to grow and reproduce more and more. It causes that light not to be able to travel to the bottom layer, and then that ecosystem does not function properly. So severe algae blooms can disturb the functioning of the entire ecosystem. So this is why we keep phosphorus and nitrogen and those things in check when we do fertilizers near aquatic ecosystems. So the movement of each nutrient through ecosystems depends on the movement of all the others, because all are needed for living systems to function. And so if you take any of these, if you increase one of these and decrease one of the other, it disrupts whatever ecosystem it's happening in. All right, so here are your questions for this chapter. Or for this lesson, I'm sorry. So you do these 8 questions. I've listed them already for you in your assignment. So just go over them, answer the questions 1 through 8, use the slides, use the video, use your book, use Google, use your resources to figure out the questions. All right, so I'll see you guys later. Thank you for coming by. Thank you for seeing my video. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope it was nice and easy and straight to the point. And I hope you guys learned a lot. Love you. See you guys later.